All right, everyone. Good afternoon. Buenas tardes. Boa tarde. And welcome to everyone in attendance today. Welcome to the second installment of the Black and Latin America Speaker Series. My name is Dr. Jaira Harrington, Assistant Professor in the Black Studies Department at UIC. And today I will serve for the moderator for our talk, The Black Youth Have an Active Voice Now, the hip hop scene in Sao Paulo, Brazil, featuring our guest speaker, Dr. Jaqueline Lima Santos. Here's the rundown of today's schedule. So I will provide some background about the series. And second, I'll introduce our speaker. She will then give her talk. And last, we will have open Q&A where comments in the chat will be acknowledged, and you can also raise your hand so that you can dialogue directly with our guest, and then we'll close for the afternoon. So just a bit of background about the series before we launch into our talk for today. With support from the Programming Committee in Latin American Latino Studies, Black Studies will host an ongoing speaker series on Blackness in Latin America for the entirety of spring 2022. Now, this interdisciplinary series will feature 5 scholars with expertise from all across Latin America, with countries including Brazil, Colombia, and Cuba. Each event will provide an opportunity for participants to explore the historical and contemporary narratives of Black communities in Latin America. Now, today's speaker, Jaqueline Lima Santos, holds a PhD in Social Anthropology from UNICAMP and was a Harvard Alumni Fellow. She works as a teacher, consultant, and researcher in the areas of equity, race, gender, education, childhood, and youth. She also has extensive work and research experience in Afro-Brazilian and African history and culture in African Portuguese-speaking countries. Today, she will guide us through the talk, The Black Youth Have an Active Voice Now, the hip hop scene in Sao Paulo, Brazil. Please let us welcome Dr. Jaqueline Lima Santos.
Good afternoon, everyone. Firstly, I want to say thanks for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with everyone to talk about Brazilian hip hop and how the hip hop culture changed the Black youth, Black young people perspective in this country. It's really basic about Brazilian hip hop. I think the most here don't know about this, but if I'm talking about something that you know, you can write in the chat. I'm starting, I put my presentation here, 1 minute. It's a part of my research that I did in Hip Hop Archive at Harvard University. It's 10 years ago, but it's also important to understand the formation and the roots of Brazilian hip hop. Here in my cover, you can see King Nino Brown. He is the first member of Zulu Nation in Brazil and Africa Bambata. I put this pic because it demonstrates a connection that I want to explore here in this presentation. Everyone is hearing me. I'm not seeing you because my presentation is full in my screen.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Here, firstly, I will present the hypothesis to understand how African diasporic cultural expression of hip hop became a political movement among Black youth in Brazil. At first, I understand that the African diaspora culture and its globalization, commercialization provided images, symbols that give information to the public sphere in the world. It is my first hypothesis, and it's also provided elements about Black struggle. Secondly, the similar effect of that population growth in São Paulo and in New York impacted the way that hip hop to develop in this context. And finally, the similar effect of the population growth I said before, we have a similar effect of the population growth and hip hop among the marginalized communities in São Paulo and New York. And finally, the influence that the cultural exchange between Black youth in São Paulo, Brazil, São Paulo specifically, and Nova York, US, had on Black movement and identity in São Paulo. We have the effect of this exchange contributes to the diasporic connection. According to Paul in Small Acts, the Afro-Atlantic triangle we understand we understand as a Afro-Atlantic triangle, America, Caribbean, Europe, and Africa, mobilized struggles and promoted mutual actions of images and symbols. And this phenomenon allowed the circulation of Black personalities, books, tracts, newsletters, and demonstrated the transnational power of Black music, which has exceeded the boundaries of the national state. Gilroy argues that the vinyl records, for example, of Black music represent one of the means to disseminate issues experienced by Black people and also allowed the sharing of styles and symbols that form the ideology of Blackness. In addition, the music facilitates the circulation of ideas to pleasure and desire, which are important political elements that exceed the commercial impact. We can talk about Afro-Brazilian hip hop and how hip hop gave active voice to rappers, to hip hoppers in Brazil, without to talk about Afro-Brazilian experience. So before I talk about hip hop, I want to remind you of the racial politics of Brazil in 20th century. This paint that can you see in the screen, A Redenção de Can, English, The Redemption of Can. It's this late 19th century paint was by Modesto Brocos, illustrates the whitening ideology in Brazil. Grandmother is Black, you can say, grandmother is Black, the daughter is brown, and her son that she had with white, poor white immigrants is a light brown child, for example. In Brazil, scientific racism and social Darwinism legitimized white racial supremacy and encouraged European immigration. Initially, racial mixture was considered degenerative and led to the creation of an inferior people. It was the idea. Later, the idea of the superiority of white race meant that miscegenation would, with time, eliminate Blacks. Someone said this in the beginning of the last century. In the 1930s, Gilberto Freire, influenced by Franz Boas, broke up with the idea of racial hierarchic paradigm and separated race from culture. It's important. chance in our social imaginary, but we had another problems about this reading. He rejected the idea of whitening and scientific racism, Gilberto Freire, and celebrated the miscegenation as a positive mark of Brazilian identity. At the same time, he defended that in general, in Brazil, happens the harmonious encounter or mix between different races. This was the foundation of the racial democracy ideology. It is important to say that Gilberto Freire didn't write racial democracy, but his ideology was really as a racial democracy. We say the ideology, his interpretation about Brazil is racial democracy, but he did not use this concept. In 1950s, UNESCO launched an investigation about racial relations in Brazil. The goals of these studies were to understand the country as an example of racially harmonic society. However, these studies revealed that Brazil was not a racial democracy, and racial prejudice was existent in every community investigated, from north to south, including Pernambuco, Salvador, Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, among others. And it's important because we understand this way about the understanding of racial relations in Brazil, because Brazilian hip hoppers, rappers contested these ideologies, these interpretations. The other important point that we need to explore here is that the urban abandonments in São Paulo and New York that connect and build an identification between Black youth, poor youth in São Paulo and New York. Blacks from very early in post-emancipation Brazil did not believe they lived in a racially democratic system. For example, in São Paulo, there were, in the beginning of the 20th century, public places in which Blacks were not allowed. These places in the central region included clubs, theaters, cinemas, as well as privileged spaces for education. The poor population moved from the now gentrified downtown districts to districts. The São Paulo government built an expansion plan for the city where the poor population would be transferred to the suburbs. According to an anthropologist, Teresa Caldeira, in the suburbs, the poor become squatters in these districts without basic services such as hospitals, schools, security, paved streets, electricity, sanitation, water treatment, etc. With limited research, the population living in these regions began to construct their houses without planning, as you can see in these images. The result was the formation of the shantytowns, the favelas. In New York, similar process happened in New York before São Paulo, although it was more complicated because the suburbs and certain areas of Manhattan and outside Manhattan were occupied by upper and middle residents, while others were by poor Blacks and immigrants. I will not go into detail of these questions because you know more about New York. But suffice it to say that both New York and São Paulo became during the 20th century places characterized by racial inequalities and violence. we can then say that they were similar from a social structure point of view. Okay. Now about the Black movement, because the roots of hip hop movement in Brazil is related about the roots of Black movements. As a result of prejudice and territorial exclusion, in the first decades of the 20th century, the Black community in São Paulo organized recreational Black organizations and social clubs, some of which had elitist aspirations, others that promoted the culture produced in Afro-Brazil, for example, samba, afoxé, maracatu, as a response to the system of racial and class domination. Example of the first kind of organizations and ideological perspective include so-called Black press and political organization known as a Brazilian Black Front, which both sought the integration of Black in class society, fought for citizenship, and didn't care about African roots yet, sometimes even criticized Afro-cultural manifestations and backwards. In the same time, other groups celebrated jongo, maracatu, capoeira, candomblé, among others. In the second half of the 20th century, the Black movement and cultural and political organizations were reconfigured in regards to identity politics and becoming increasingly Africanist. According to Guimarães, an important sociologist in Brazil, the persistence of racism and racial inequalities led to the creation of movements of racial consciousness. In the book Lugar de Negro, the critics Lélia Gonzalez and Carlos Hansbaum asserted that the high indices of racial inequalities in 1970s, based in official statistics now collected and systematically studied regarding to education, health, employment, housing. These data clearly showed racial democracy as a myth. From the 1960s, among a growing numbers of Blacks, the notion of stereotyped Afro-Brazilian culture was replaced by the idea of Black culture, in close connection with developments in the so-called Black Atlantic, US, Caribbean, and Africa. The unified Black movement was created in 1978. If most militants of the first half of the 20th century in São Paulo fought to be counted as part of a national identity, from the 1970s, they claimed a transnational reference. And other movements in the Black diaspora gained significant importance, such as civil rights movements, Black Power, Black Muslims, especially Malcolm X, and Black Panther Party in US spied their politics. Oh, a minute. 1 minute. Despite of the early of 20th century urban reconstruction in São Paulo, the Black youth reoccupied downtown São Paulo in the 1970s to today. It's really it's a currently movement. On Fridays, they through Black parties in the streets, consume ethnic products like music, aesthetics, go to salons specialized specialized in African hairdo, and they build significant social networks. They live in the suburbs, but they leave their houses to enjoy their Black music in São Paulo downtown, making it a space for ethnic identification and reference, where they can exchange information about Black scenery, and then they go back home to socialize information in their local communities through images and symbols, like hair, stamps in t-shirts, music, and also discourse, a public discourse. In the early of 1980s, the precursors of hip-hop culture occupied this vision to exchange information about the new hip-hop movement arriving in Brazil. In this video, you can see the Black presence in São Paulo downtown. Here you can see a little about Black youth's use of this place.
Yo, man, here we go. Practice, man. What you doing? Oh, man, we and the homeboys is going down to party. Yeah. Oh, man, over there. Hey, man, I'm gonna hang out for the yeah, well, that was about to advertise. Man, I know y'all gonna be in the car, man. What's up with that? Yeah, man, I heard we in the mall. Nah, man, I heard stop the rock. Nah, man, stop the rock. Throw down, man. Throw down. You guys gonna come and throw down. Let's go. Just chill out. Say home. Go on.
Márcio Macedo, who is an important sociologist in Brazil, he's an important sociologist on hip hop studies, and now he is finishing his PhD in sociology at the New School for Social Research in New York, but he's a Brazilian. According to Macedo, from 1950s, Brazil began under a strong American influence, with great access goods such as phonographs and vinyl albums. These goods provided the means by which Blacks in São Paulo began to have greater contact with American artists. During this time, since Blacks were prevented by economic and social factors from gathering in public spaces, backyard parties were organized. During the 1960s and 1970s, the sound system teams were responsible for making Black parties of São Paulo enclosed space extremely popular. Black parties, in Portuguese, bailes blacks, displayed local artists. It was also through the Black parties that the sense of diaspora and ideas such as Pan-Africanism or Blackness spread in Brazil. The Black parties that happened in São Paulo, Salvador, or Rio de Janeiro united Black population and expanded Black power consciousness. According to another author, Pimentel, these parties featured the slide projections with scenes from movies about Black Americans, along with photos of Black celebrities, musicians, and athletes from Brazil and abroad. These parties also disseminated by African American rights. These parties also disseminated ideas by African American rights and militants. Books such as Some Ice by ex-planter Ed Cleaver, Roots by Alex Haley, articles by Angela Davis and Malcolm X, and above all James Brown musics, for example. You can see an image here of these parties. Ideas spread in songs such as James Brown's Say It Loud, I'm Black, I'm Proud, were taken as a reference for the construction of Black pride and identity. It was through the commercialization of these albums, you can see some ideas that circulate with this commercialization. It was through this commercialization that Brazilian Blacks were giving information about what happened in Black USA. They learned about music, about Black youth, and civil rights movement, about African history, and which led them to explore Afro-Brazilian history too. The roots of Brazilian hip hop are in Black parties. It is that because it's important to talk about, we talk until here to understand hip hop. The Black Party was a place where Black youth can feel among equals and where entertainment is experienced as an alternative movement, different from everyday racism. In those parts, racial hierarchy that is present in everyday life, the most time disappears. Is what say an important anthropologist in Brazil, João Batista Félix, important to understand Black parties and hip hop movements. We can see in the screen some flyers of this part about Brazilian Black parties. These flyers give us information about which kind of song the people were listening in these parts, like soul, funk. In the first flyer you can get here, you can get information about music through the phrase "A Noite Soul Funk," the Soul Funk Night. Under these slides, you can hear. You can read the word Pantera. Pantera in Portuguese does not have the letter H, but they put it having as a reference the Black Panther Party. In the right side, you can see the flyer about James Brown's show in São Paulo in 1978, organized by a Black sound team called Chic Show. And James Brown is an icon in Brazil. In fact, many DJs and artists use Brown as their name in honor of the godfather of soul. You can see two flyers of other party named Black News, for example. Here, I put a video. It's a testimony of Eduardo and Luizão. They were owner of Chic Show. Chic Show is an important team that does parties in São Paulo and throughout Brazil.
Eu acho que o movimento funk foi tudo, porque ó, nós aprendemos a usar o corte do cabelo, nós aprendemos se vestir, nós aprendemos a fazer tudo. Era uma cultura, a música, o funk foi uma cultura para nossas origens.
Quem entrou pela música, quem entrou pela roupa, quem entrou pela união, trazer o pessoal para uma outra posição, em cima de elegância, a beleza dele, trazer para esse modo, que é o lado de você promover uma raça. Só promover a raça, E a raça ela tem uma força atlética, tem a força artística, inteligente. Todas as coisas, inclusive, que sempre foram negadas, foram sempre instruídas.
Geralmente as roupas eram sapato, bico fino, aquelas calças com bom vinco, uma boa camisa de seda, chapéu de vez em quando, virado do lado direito. A gente já se inspirava no James Brown nos Estados Unidos.
And Eduardo Scotecário and Luizão Chic Show that you hear now, they are among the most important DJs in Brazil. And they hosted Black parties in 1970s and talk about the impact of African diasporic music here. From São Paulo City, because we were talking about Black parties in São Paulo. From São Paulo City, we have São Paulo City, the capital, and we have São Paulo State, like New York, New York City and New York State. From São Paulo City, Black parties spread quickly to São Paulo's interior. In the early of 20th century, Black people in São Paulo's interior had to create own places for entertainment, known as Black social clubs, because they could not go to the white place for sociability or white controlled clubs, for example. Black social clubs sought information about Black music in São Paulo City in the form of vinyl records, magazines, and beauty products. In my master dissertation, I named this process as a Black corridor because the Black social clubs built networks responsible to spread quickly the ideas arriving in São Paulo's Black parties. São Paulo is localized, São Paulo is localized here in red. São Paulo is localized in Brazil, southeastern, and São Paulo capital is in São Paulo too. Here is São Paulo in red. Next city, for example, is Jundiaí. There have a Black social club. They attend the Black party in São Paulo, for example, buy vinyl records there, and reproduce this movement in their club. And it was reproduced in another cities. For example, here we have Campinas, São Carlos, Sorocaba, Araraquara, and another cities. So these Black social clubs build a Black corridor that allow these ideas and symbols to spread quickly throughout the state. Now about the hip hop movement, finally. In Black parties, thousands of young Blacks attending the dances began to organize themselves in terms of identity politics and in the streets of downtown and throughout the city of São Paulo. It was through the commercialization of US-made albums, as I already said, that they were giving information about hip-hop culture. They had contact with new dances through videos that DJs projected in the dance hall or street walls in these Black parties. Hip-hop magazines published in the US by hip-hoppers were also read. As noted by DJ KLJ, he's a DJ of important rap group in Brazil. It's like a Public Enemy in Brazil. The name of this group is Racionais MCs. He says, a guy got a magazine, translated it in a broken English, and took it to the people. The first meeting place of young hip hopper was São Bento Square, and soon after, the Low Class Shopping Mall, Kennedy, 24 de maio, Galeria 24 de maio, 24th of May. May 24. Followed by public places like President Roosevelt Square, and it was at São Bento Square that breakdancers presented their techniques and began to spread this knowledge not only with their bodies, but also with their minds. It was also there that Brazilian rap was born, which was sung over clapping hands and beats made with mouth beats. Here is a video, it's 1984, that showed us how they occupied the São Paulo downtown.
Eles vieram de todas as partes da cidade para assistir ao festival. Bonés, óculos, luvas, roupas largas e coloridas como exige o break. Uma dança que surgiu nos guetos negros de Nova York nos anos 70 e que desde o ano passado virou moda nas ruas de São Paulo. O festival, marcado para as 10 da manhã, atrasou 2 horas, o que não tirou o bom humor dos grupos. Na Praça da Sé, o break parecia uma gostosa brincadeira, que ganhou inclusive a simpatia dos mais velhos. Dá para dançar? Já dá. Eu não, mas os jovens sim. No festival, os 10 melhores grupos de break das ruas de São Paulo fizeram uma exibição de ritmo, perícia e muita criatividade.
Sorry, because I don't have subtitles for this video, but I think the images show a lot, give you a lot of information about this contest. I think it's important to say also that this video was recorded in the same year of Beat Street. Beat Street is a traditional film about US hip hop history, and the images are really similar. And the video show how youth occupy São Paulo's squares at that time. In the squares, Brazilian hip hop has created the first Brazilian hip hop organization, which we call Hip Hop Passes. The name of this organization was Sindicato Negro, English Black Trade Union. United in these public places, they talked about history, realities, and new expectations of life. Organized in these public spaces, they created also the first hip hop magazine, Pode Crer, in English, Can You Believe It? Produced with Gueledés Black Women Institute. In these magazines, you can know a lot also about the roots of Brazilian hip hop. In this material, you can explore a little about hip hop identity and politics in São Paulo. The first issue, for example, you see Mano Brown. He is the MC of one of the best rap group in Brazil, Racionais MCs, that I said a few times ago. And he created the popular phrase among Black youth in Brazil that I put in the title of this presentation. A juventude negra agora tem voz ativa. It in English is Black youth have an active voice now. You can see too in this issue the biography of Malcolm X. In the second issue, you see Vítima Fatal rap group, in English Fatal Victim. And they present also Steve Biko biography and one topic about gender and women recognized in hip hop. In the third issue, you can see Queen Zinga biography, Câmbio Negro rap group, and one topic about Chic Show, the bigger business for Black Party in São Paulo, the business of Luizão that I showed in the video. In the last issue, number 4, you can see Kwame Nkrumah biography and reflections about racial consciousness. So hip hop became the Black youth political movement in São Paulo. From downtown, these young people took hip hop movement to their neighborhoods and built hip hop organization called PASSes. Os Mundupinho defines PASSes as a collective groups that are organized locally in neighborhoods or regions with the aim to rescuing the self-esteem of youth and promoting political awareness, even with the role of the neighborhood posts, downtown remains a place of reference and exchange of hip-hop culture. The posts of hip-hoppers gained wide visibility in 1990s for their ability to mobilize, coordinate, and dialogue with local youths. Hip-hop would go on to be effective at bringing transformations that were necessary for the betterment of poor neighborhoods, creating alternative place of sporadic entertainment. Other than that, there were various young people who changed their lives through contact with hip-hop culture, leaving criminality and drugs. Hip-hop has become a lifestyle for these activities. About the photos. This first, we can see hip-hop as a Black movement. In the first picture, you see members from different PASSes, hip-hop PASSes in São Paulo downtown, meeting Fred Hampton Jr., the son of the Black Panthers, Fred Hampton. The second one, you can see hip-hop house, Casa de hip-hop house, as a consequence of hip-hoppers' work in their communities. The most hip-hoppers became social educators. And in 1999, they occupied one public place in the Diadema city and created the first hip-hop house in Brazil. There, they teach four hip-hop elements and also knowledge through hip-hop houses library, where I started my research, I think 15 years ago. You can see hip-hop house library. And also hip-hop is a political movement. And hip-hop movement have had their work recognized. And today, Brazilian hip-hoppers produce a little public policies for this movement from the state. Here you can see a meeting of these hip-hoppers with the president, ex-president Lula, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. And about the exchange between hip-hoppers in São Paulo and New York. Through this disc record, The Light, Africa Bambaataa and Family, in the early of 1990s, Nino Brown had access to the Zulu Nation's address and started to exchange letters with African-American hip-hoppers. Nino wrote these letters in Portuguese and received answer in English. It was really crazy. Then he exchanged letters with other activists and even with political prisoners. And he was always sending in Portuguese, someone translate there for who were there, and they answer in English and someone translates to Portuguese here. And through these letters, they exchange ideas, campaigns, and struggles. In 1999, Africa Bambaataa, one of the founding fathers of hip hop, visited Brazil founded the Zulu nation here in Brazil and named Nino Brau as a King Nino Brau and a legitimate representative of Zulu nation in Brazil. Today, King Nino Brau is found in other Zulu nations in Latin America. You can see in this pic Nino Brau. Taíde is an important rapper in Brazil, and África Bambata in São Paulo. Here you can see some letters that they exchanged. These letters are now in Brazilian Hip Hop Archive at UNICAMP. It's the State University of Campinas. It's an important university in Latin America. And they started last year Hip Hop Archive. You can see some ideas in these letters. This presentation here is here hip hop house, África Bambata in hip hop house Alguém in 2002. In the banner is right, Diadema salute to the hip hop world father, África Bambata. This presentation has argued that race in Brazil gained a new meaning after contact with hip hop culture. The new generation of Black movement activists in São Paulo is majority from hip hop or member of hip hop generation. Black social clubs and Black parties introduced a vibrant Black identity through African American music and African diasporic music and protests. The Black corridors spread hip hop quickly in the late 1970s and introduced new elements for Black pride and connection with others of African descent. Brazilian hip hoppers has a popular phrase, Black youth have an active voice now. This phrase came after contact with hip hop in São Paulo. Although if they borrowed elements from African American culture, it's important to say that Brazilian hip hop has particularities. I will let other popular phrase by Brazilian hip hoppers. The culture without movement is blind, and the movement without culture is crippled. I will just finish with one video and one question. Why hip hop is important in Brazilian society?
Tem que acreditar. Desde cedo a mãe da gente fala assim, filho, você ser preto, você tem que ser 2 vezes melhor. Passado alguns anos eu pensei, como fazer 2 vezes melhor se você está pelo menos 100 vezes atrasado? Pela escravidão, pela história, pelo preconceito, pelos traumas, pelas psicoses, por tudo que aconteceu. 2 vezes melhor como? Ou melhora, ou ser o melhor ou é o pior de uma vez. E sempre foi assim. Se você vai escolher o que estiver mais perto de você, o que estiver dentro da sua realidade. Você vai ser 2 vezes melhor como? Quem inventou isso aí? Quem foi o pilantra que inventou isso aí? Acorda pra vida, rapaz.
É necessário sempre acreditar que o sonho é possível, que o céu é o limite e você tudo é imbatível. E o tempo ruim vai passar, é só uma fase. E o sofrimento alimenta mais a sua coragem. Que a sua família precisa de você, lado a lado, se ganhar, pra te apoiar, se perder. A luta, amor entre homem, filho e mulher, a única verdade universal que mantém a fé. Olha as crianças que é o futuro e a esperança, que ainda não conhece. Não seja o que é ódio e ganância. Eu vejo o rico que teme perder a fortuna, enquanto o mano desempregado, viciado, essa bunda. Falo do enfermo, irmão, falo do sangue, então falo da rua que pra esse louco mundão. Que o caminho da cura pode ser a doença, que o caminho do perdão às vezes é sentença. Desavença, treta e falsa união. A ambição é como véu que segue de mão, que nem carro guiado na estrada da vida, sem farol no deserto das trevas perdida. Eu fui hoje ébrio, louco, mas hoje eu tô sóbrio. Vai no revólver enquanto você me fala em ódio. Eu vejo o corpo, a mente, a alma, o espírito. Ouço repente o que diz lá no canto lírico. Falo do cérebro e do coração. Vejo egoísmo e preconceito de mão pra irmão. A vida não é problema, é batalha, desafio. Cada obstáculo é uma lição, eu anuncio. É isso aí, pode parar. Esperar o tempo ruim vir te abraçar. Acreditar que sonhar sempre é preciso. É o que mantém os irmãos. Várias famílias, vários barracos, uma mina grávida.
So for finish, I can say that hip hop is responsible to promote in the suburbs new expectations through reflections about history, African roots, social realities, and agency. They discover that they can change their reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Santos, for that incredible, fascinating presentation. And centering Black communities, we were able to clearly observe the transnational flows and dynamic nature of hip hop culture in the Americas. It is also powerful to witness the affirmation of Black identity and heritage among Afro-Brazilians in the face of a society that you clearly described has historically excluded, marginalized, and erased the community with dominant narratives of racial democracy. The early influences of artists like Racionais continue on with voices of hip hop artists, including the likes of Emicida, Linda Quebrada, MC Sofia, and Ricky Barbosa. And that active voice continues today. So now what we'll do is welcome comments, questions, and reflections from the viewing public. Yes, Professor Inda.
First of all, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what makes Brazilian hip hop unique. Because I think one of the things that you see as hip hop has circulated globally, each place that has taken it up, if it's Italy, France, the UK, has given kind of the genre a particular spin, and kind of people have made it their own in a way. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about what has Brazilian hip hop done to make it kind of unique?
One more question, or can I answer?
Feel free to respond.
Okay. I think hip hop, Brazilian hip hop, is unique because they identified themselves with people who who born hip hop because they similar realities, and similar reality has relation with the history. We both have a colonial past, and we are under a racial society. We are under racism, and we need to struggle against racism. And so they identified them with US hip hoppers because this. But they are always talking about the local scenes, the local reality. If you listen music or look at Brazilian graffiti, we are projecting our reality. our identity. We mix a global culture, hip hop, with local culture and rhymes like samba. You can hear hip hop sampling samba, for example, or you can see Brazilian break dancers doing breaking with some capoeira influence, for example, but they are part of a global movement, but they are addressing local problems about the national politics, about the local exclusion, about the reality in the schools, in their neighborhoods. They use hip hop as a tool to change their reality, focusing in this reality.
Thank you for that response. Any other questions or comments, reflections on what it is that you've seen today? Professor Jewell, see your hand there.
Yes, thank you for a great presentation. This has been fascinating. I'm wondering about the relationship between hip hop and Black feminism that we see in the United States. Is there a parallel, or are there similar kinds of discussions happening in Brazil?
Yes, I think the similar agenda that is related to hip hoppers in US and Brazil is police violence, and that is murdering a lot of Black young people, specifically Black men. And it's really similar because when Brazilian hip hop listening "Fuck the Police" from NWA, and they are listening something related their reality because they can't circulate it throughout the city without to be stopped by the police, and this stop is so violent. I think the most similar narrative or agenda is this kind of violence in their everyday life.
So would you, I'm sorry, is it okay if I ask another question?
Sure, you can follow up.
Okay, so I'm just thinking that, so there's this concern with the kind of gendered violence that's happening where young Black men are being targeted, yes? Is there any discussion about the kind of gendered violence that happens to Black women in this context, or is that something that's not yet kind of a focus?
Yes, we have a lot of black young girls addressing the violence about the Black women bodies in Brazil, specifically the sexist view of the Black women body, and that sexualize these bodies and don't think about this body as a human body and a body that works, that think, that produce science, and they are addressing the violence based in these stereotypes. That it's important to say that it's important and problematic to say that in Brazil, the most victims of sexual violence or domestic violence are Black women. And the Black young boys are talking about this, but they are talking about the reality of their mothers, the mothers that created them alone, for example, and it's so representative to them. But young Black girls are talking about in first person about the reality and the violence present in their everyday life.
Any other comments or questions or reflections that anyone would like to share? I'll jump in quickly. So something that you mentioned in your talk was your experience researching, living, and working in Cambridge and going to the hip hop archives to develop your transnational, transnational dimensions of your research on hip hop there. And you also mentioned that there's an archive that exists in Sao Paulo. Could you tell us a bit about these archives, what they entail, who is involved with their development, and who is involved with their upkeep, and just give us a sense of what those archives hold so that we can know a little bit more about both of these contexts comparatively.
I always think about that hip hop is a lens for I understand different situations or contexts in society. I can understand economy through hip hop. I can understand your urban development through hip hop. I can understand gender relations through hip hop. I can understand public policies for security through hip hop and the right to the seat through hip hop. So I think hip hop as a everyday narrative amplify our lens to understand the society because they are reading and talking and narrating the society. So when I come from, I came to the hip hop archive in Harvard for my experience studying hip hop in New York and São Paulo, the connections between Black youth hip hop in New York and São Paulo. I had an experience that I could stay in a place where I met people studying hip hop in every country, in every part of the world. It was important because I had contact with scholars studying the politics of nation through rappers' narratives in post-colonial context. I had contact with people studying hip hop in war context, young people living in war context, and different problematics. In post-colonial context, or are immigrants living in other parts of the world, and how it reflects in education, in health, in education, in health, in security, and other topics. So this opportunity to stay in a place where people are studying hip hop throughout the world give me an idea that I can understand more than the Brazilian context. I can study another context. So I wrote a proposal for a PhD in social anthropology to understand Angolan context. Firstly, I want to understand African Portuguese, African Portuguese speaking countries in general, but it's so complicated because it's a really recent post-colonial context. And I chose to stay on in Angola, and I lived there for 6 months. And Angola was under war until 2002, and it's a country in a reconstruction. And there is a lot inequalities, so much inequalities. And who is narrating? Who narrating is talking about the organization of the society, the state, the politics, these inequalities, and the feelings of nation, or how we can build our nation. Popularly, who are building this understanding are rappers. And I understood a lot about Angola history and Angola reality, talking to rappers, to hip hoppers, listening their music, and I understand the different conflicts and the different movement in the changing of this society. So they produce more than narratives. They produce narratives about different movements that contribute to us analyze the context, but they produce tests, they produce programs in radio station, for example, and other things. And these materials are so important to the memory of the suburbs, of the society, of the different periods. For example, in Brazil, if you want to understand the reality of the suburbs, the shanty towns in 1990s, you need to study rap music, because they build narratives about everyday life, how people are living, what are our life conditions, what are our problems, what are our aesthetics, for example. For you understand, you need to study rap music. And what rap music was talking about at that time, scholars are talking about the building of violence in suburbs today. They are addressing this, looking for the everyday life so much before, for example. So when we have archives focused on hip hop productions, we can understand, we have a memory of our society, a memory of the reality of young people, Black young people in the suburbs. We have a memory about the aesthetics, about how they were changing their identity, so how they were changing their communities. I think it's part in Brazil, for example, of the social thinking of Brazilian society, social knowledge. So this needs to be studied as a social thinking, Brazilian social thinking, for example.
Well stated, well stated. Anyone else would like to provide some comments, questions, reflections? Were you taken by anything it is that you saw? Oh, we do have a question here in the chat from John Quinto. Could you kindly reiterate what the corridors were? What was the was the creation of the corridors more structured like the creation of New York City's boroughs? Or was the development of the corridor mainly to allow the spread of information? So during your presentation, you mentioned the corridors and the exchange of hip hop and the evolution of hip hop's movement from the center of the city of Sao Paulo out to the broader regions of the state. So if you could speak more about this corridor, its development, how you came to theorize it, we'd love to hear more about it.
About Black corridors, I think it's related the realities of the Black population that I said that Blacks were not allowed to enjoy the white entertainment place, for example. There were a lot of barriers to then access this place. So they create their place for sociability, entertainment. And these were connected because the reality were not different in São Paulo and in São Paulo interiors. But São Paulo capital were a place where people seek for materials, vinyl records, and information, because the commercialization was concentrated there. And people from the interior come to São Paulo to enjoy these parties and buy magazines, cassettes. I don't know if you say cassettes in English.
Cassette tapes.
Cassettes and magazines, cassettes, vinyl records, and they bought this and bring it to the social clubs interior to make their parties, for example. And people who are in the most interior of the state sometimes don't come to São Paulo, but come to a city near from them, near to them. And in these seats, in this party, they get informations, get these materials, and reproduce these parties in their territories. So I think it was not structured, but the conditions brought people to build these connections. I don't know if I answered completely.
Thank you, thank you. And just to turn to a comment here from Miriam, I would like to mention the research of Brazilian scholar Ana Lucia Silva Souza, who coined the term literacies of re-existence. Youth engaged in hip hop movements have very powerful literacy practices that help to resist and exist within structural racism. And given your background, Professor Santos, on education, on childhood, on youth, could you speak to the importance of literacy and hip hop and its role perhaps in educating the youth of today about these issues of structural racism that they confront on a day-to-day basis? Do you see that happening in educational settings?
Mm-hmm. Yes. In Brazil, the most hip hoppers in 1980s become social educators, because the way that they were teaching their communities and young people like them or child to think critically about the society. So they start to work in different organizations as educators to change the society. But we have two ways to think about this. One is to analyze hip hop as educators and their pedagogies to teach the society. It's one way. Another way is about how hip hop bring us to a literacy world, because people who does not don't identify themselves with the school, because the methodology, because the racism, because the exclusion, sometimes get more time to develop the literacy tools, for example. But when they listen a music like rap music that is addressing their reality, they start to write about their own reality, and they are reading the reality, reading the word, and writing in the first person how they are viewing this. Sorry, viewing this. And I think in this way, hip hop brings us to the literacy place.
Fantastic. And as we're wrapping up, I did miss a question, but I want to bring it back up. Professor Ana Luisa Alves, who joined us in our last session and presented on her work in Cuba, asked, can Dr. Santos talk a little bit about her own trajectory in hip hop that led her to become a hip hop researcher? So what inspired you to begin this kind of research, Professor Santos?
Because when I was teenager, I was an MC. I perceived myself in the world through rap music, and I started to be an MC. I was writing my music, I was singing, but I was also part of a hip hop PESI. And in these hip hop local organizations with another people like me, we were building social movements to transform the society. And we wanted also to build narratives in first person, but in books, in the science. And everyone was thinking we need to go to the university to talk about our own history. So I came to the university and I became an anthropologist. Hip hop brought me to the university.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I did not know you were an MC. And are you continuing this track through your work? Is that something that you?
I don't know if I can.
But fascinating, certainly, to hear what led you to this point. Are there any other questions, comments, thoughts about what you've seen here? This has been such a rich experience, such a wonderful exchange. We appreciate everyone's participation. There are a few minutes left, so I'll give it about a minute. And if we're settled here, then we'll go on ahead and close for the afternoon. But I'll give you about a minute to think of something or share any comments or thoughts. So we'll just go on ahead and leave it here. Next week, we will return to our regularly scheduled Talkback Tuesday Black and Latin America speaker series on Tuesday, March 1 at 11 a.m. with Dr. Gabriela Barreto Gissá. And the discussion topic will be the history of slavery, rights of Black women, and racism in Brazil. So please be sure to join us on next week for that presentation. Thank you. So, and registration is there in the link. So please do join us. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Santos. And we look forward to seeing you in the next event. May you all have a great, great week and take good care. Bye-bye now.